Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Hello, and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is the founder at Greenlight Guru, Jon Speer. And joining me today is Mike Drues. Mike is the president of Vascular Sciences. And if you've listened to any Global Medical Device Podcast episodes over the past, it's been a lot of years now, there's a good chance you've heard Mike and I chat about a variety of topics ranging from quality to regulatory to CAPA and a litany of other things. But Mike, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, John. Always a pleasure to speak with you and your audience.
Yeah. So for those listening, they may not know, you and I kind of riff back and forth in between the times that we chat and try to find topics that are, somewhat evergreen or at least timely and relevant. And, one topic that I think is, it's been timely and relevant for a long, long time, and probably timely and relevant for at least the long foreseeable future is regulatory submissions, and specifically here in the U.S., the workhorse, I think, as you've referred to it before, of regulatory submissions from FDA for med device is 510K. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about that today.
Yeah, I think, John, that's a great idea. And as you said, the 510K is without a doubt the workhorse in the United States of the medical device industry. And in spite of that, or perhaps because of that, it continues to be a source of problems, a source of delays, a source of rejections with a lot of companies in this industry. And one of the most common questions I get from my customers and from people across the board is, how do we avoid these common problems? Yeah. And so I came across this column, John, written about 5 years ago from this really oddball character named Jon Speer. I don't know, I need to meet this guy, called 7 Common Mistakes That Sink 510K Clearances. And I thought what we could do today in today's discussion is kind of go through the 7 common mistakes as you've identified them and talk about if anything has changed in the last 5 years, and more importantly, how can people listening today avoid these common mistakes? Does that make sense, John?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you blew the dust off that article. And I guess we'll find out here in a few moments, but I hope this article from 5 years ago is obsolete and irrelevant today, but my suspicion is it's probably not.
I would love to agree with you, John, but unfortunately, that might be true in the land of rainbows and unicorns, but it's not true in the real world where I work.
Yeah, all right.
So let's dig right into it and start out with the first of the 7 common mistakes that you identified, and that is inconsistency with documentation. Inconsistency with documentation. And let me start out with a direct quote from your column, John, and that is, the intended use statement often is screwed up. That's your words. Screwed up by incomplete application into other sections of the 510K. I'm pretty sure I know what you mean by that, John, but for the benefit of the audience, so why don't you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. And folks, we'll be sure to provide a link to that article from 5 years ago so that you can read along after the fact. But nonetheless, so the intended use statement, is a pretty important, I think, premise for any 510K submission, because for all intents and purposes, that statement helps regulators and helps you determine how your product is ultimately going to be classified, what you can claim and all these sorts of things about the product. But that statement is, I don't remember exactly, you probably know exactly, but I know it is stated several times throughout a 510K submission. My memory recalls there's at least a handful of times where throughout a 510K where that statement is stated. I believe there is one section that is completely dedicated to the intended use, and there's a form, I believe, that one fills out to identify what that is. But there's several other places, other sections within a 510K where the statement is also listed as well. What I mean by screwed up is, sadly, I've seen this a lot. I suspect you probably have a time or two as well, where that statement is not the same. It is not consistent throughout one's own 510K submission. It's stated one way in one place and maybe slightly differently in another place, and so on and so forth. I got to believe that as that submission is sent to FDA for review, especially during the refuse to accept window, that 14-day window, that's the easiest thing for a reviewer to say, this is not the same throughout. So reject, send it back, which it makes sense. If I'm a reviewer, I want that statement to be the same, verbatim, word for word throughout that 510K. And if it's not, that says to me as a reviewer, maybe these people don't know what they're doing.
I agree with you 100%, John. In fact, one of the most common reasons why submissions, not just 510K submissions, but submissions across the board, de novos, PMAs, and so on, are rejected is because of what you just said. Because the labeling, and what we're talking about here is what I call the high level labeling, the intended use and the indications for use, are when they are repeated. You're exactly right. In all regulatory submissions, the high level labeling is repeated several times. And by the way, one of my frustrations with so many submissions being so long is because the same information is repeated over and over and over again. But that's a topic of a different discussion. But one of the most common reasons why they're rejected is because the high level labeling, when it's repeated, is not repeated exactly the same way. And as we've talked about before, when FDA is doing their job, and let's be honest, I know we're on a recorded podcast here, but FDA doesn't always do their job. They will scrutinize the high level labeling word by word, character by character, punctuation mark by punctuation mark. Other parts of the submission, I know for a fact, are never read by anybody in some cases, but the high level labeling is very much an exception. So you really need to make sure that you're consistent. And I know there are a lot of tools that will help companies, prepare their submissions and make sure that that doesn't happen, but it still happens anyway. And here's a simple piece of advice. Most people today have Microsoft Office or something the equivalent of that. I'm a big fan of using not just simply copy and paste, but copy and paste link. Copy and paste link is a feature in Microsoft Office that you create your high level labeling in one document. Instead of simply copying and pasting it into your submission or anywhere else, you do a copy and paste link. And that way, not only is the information exactly the same every time, but if you want to change it, you only have to change it one time, and it's automatically changed in all of the other documents. So there are very simple solutions. We're not talking about rocket science here, John. They're very simple solutions to a lot of this. So again, one of the most common mistakes that people make is when they repeat their labeling, it's not repeated exactly the same.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Another thing that you brought up in that same section, John, is a common mistake is confusion between statements that are more about indicated use than intended use. And this is something that you and I have talked about before, the difference between indications for use and intended use. So maybe we should spend a minute or two and just kind of remind our audience the difference between those two statements.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you have a very clear and concise explanation on the difference between indications for use and intended use. So, I can't say it better than you. So, so if you don't mind reminding folks there's obviously a lot of similarities, but there are some important distinctions between those two statements as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, John, thank you for those kind words.
Yeah,
I'm happy to recap what I see as the difference. And I'll just remind our audience that you and I have talked about this topic in detail in other podcasts and even in some of my webinars. So maybe we can refer to some of those for our audience. But in a nutshell, here's the big difference between intended use and indications for use. Intended use focuses on the device, whereas indications for use focuses on the patient. So taking that one step further, when I say intended use focuses on the device, that means what does the device do? How does it work? Its mechanism of action, and so on and so on. Whereas when I say indications for use focuses on the patient, what I mean by that is what disease, injury, or condition is the device intended to prevent, diagnose, or treat. Right. So intended use focuses on the device, what it does, how it works. Indications for use focuses on the patient. What disease, injury, or condition is the device intended to prevent, diagnose, or treat? Now, taking that just a step further, I've seen in several regulatory submissions that have gone through the FDA where the intended use and the indications for use are flat out wrong. And when I point out to the FDA, they say, yes, Mike, we agree with you. These statements are wrong. However, these submissions have gone through, so there's nothing we can do about it. That's our US government hard at work. What can we do? And one other thing, and then we'll move on to your next common mistake, John. One other thing about the labeling is there is no consistency across CDRH when it comes to intended use and indications for use. It drives me nuts when I hear the politicians at FDA say, well, it doesn't matter what part of FDA you're dealing with or what reviewer you're dealing with, because all of the reviewers are following the same regulation the same way. Well, with all due respect, bull, you know what? I mean, does anybody really believe that? Here's the thing. In some groups in CDRH, they like to have what I call the traditional intended use and indications for use separate and distinct, which is actually my personal preference. Right. However, in other groups within CDRH, they're okay with what I call a blended intended use indications for use statement. What you need to do before going to the FDA, and I always do this before a pre-sub, John, is find out, since we're talking about 510Ks here, clearly there's precedent for this, find out where in your particular section of CDRH that you're dealing with, do they tend to prefer separate intended use and indications for use, or a blended statement, and then give them what it is in that format?
Yeah.
So once again, John, this is definitely a common mistake, but it's a mistake that is very easily avoided.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, should we move on to the next one?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, so the next common mistake that you identify in your column is not using the checklist. And you're referring specifically to the refuse to accept, or RTA checklist. By the way, there's an RTA checklist, obviously, for the 510K, but
Right.
there's also one for the de novo and for the PMA as well.
And I think there's also different versions for 510Ks, depending on if it's a traditional or a special or an abbreviated too, right?
Absolutely correct. There are different versions of the RTA checklist. If you just look at the 510K RTA checklist guidance, there are different versions for each of those different 510K types. There is no checklist available yet for the newest version of the 510K, the safety and performance, or S510K. Whether we need one or not, I'm not sure, because it's so similar to the abbreviated one. But you're exactly right. There are versions. And as I think I pointed out in previous discussions when we talked about the RTA in more detail, John, ironic as it might sound, the abbreviated RTA checklist for the 510K is actually longer than for the traditional 510K. And comparing the 510K to the de novo to the PMA RTA checklist, ironic as it sounds, the PMA checklist is actually much shorter than either the 510K or the de novo checklist. So anyway, that's just a little bit of regulatory trivia for you and our audience to chew on. But specifically in your column, under this common mistake of not using the checklist, you say follow the checklist exactly, then give your reviewer a heads up by referring to the relevant pages in your document next to the checklist items. Can you explain to the audience, John, exactly what you mean by that? Again, I think I know what you mean, but let's hear it in your words.
Yeah, sure. The RTA checklist, I think, was intended to be a tool for the FDA reviewer when submission received, for them to go through and make sure all the constituent parts and components and what is expected to be in that submission is included. So it's kind of a guide, if you will, for that reviewer. But as submitter, as one who might be submitting a 510K, it should also be a guide, or at least, one of those final checklists that I review as well. The glorious thing about regulations a lot of time is, within reason anyway, FDA tells you what they're going to do, what they're going to look at, and that sort of thing. Now, sometimes you get into the details and there might be, some nuances or some specifics that you can't plan or anticipate, but, that's fine. But the RTA checklist tells FDA what they're looking for, and it tells you as submitter, this is what FDA is expecting. Now, there's also, the 510K submission contents that's pretty well defined and articulated as well. There certainly are guidances for this sort of thing. But the FDA, they've added this step, the refuse to accept step, that's been in place now for a bit. And I think that was in direct response to the industry, because the industry is like, oh, wait, we don't know what happens when we submit our 510K. We don't hear back from FDA. Well, they've implemented this step so that within the first, I think, 14 days, if I recall, you'll hear back from FDA. Yes, we received it. Looks good to go. And now it's moving on to the substantive review. Well, you can make life easier for yourself and for your FDA reviewer if you can put a little annotated reference. I always advise people, make a copy of that refuse to accept checklist, list in the comment section where these things are addressed within your submission, what section, what page, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes sort of, a table of contents, or at least an index for that reviewer, so they know where to find it and they can flip to the appropriate page. They say, aha, here it is, looks good to go. And include that when you submit your 510K. I think trying to keep in mind, FDA reviewers see probably dozens, maybe hundreds of submissions in a finite period of time. Some are better than others. Well, make yours stand out, make yours easier to read, help that reviewer understand the story you're telling and where they can find the important contents and components that are identified on that checklist. FDA thinks that checklist is important. So put some value into it, help them out a little bit, help yourself out a little bit.
I agree, John. And I give very similar, in fact, substantially equivalent advice to my customers all the time. As one of my customers likes to say, you have to chew FDA's food for them. And I now repeat that to virtually all of my customers. Don't expect, I think this is a totally unreasonable expectation for a reviewer to jump around and to look through hundreds or maybe thousands of pages of information to find, the one piece of information that he or she is looking for. Quite frankly, that ain't going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I have customers that tell me, well, we've already described how we do this in a publication. How about if we just cite the publication or provide the publication as an appendix at the back of the document? Well, why would you expect somebody at FDA to read through some article and extract from it whatever information that you think is the important information? You literally have to chew FDA's food for them. And I don't mean that to be patronizing. I really don't. But if you want to be in that small percentage of people that have their 510Ks cleared on the very first time, and not in the very large majority where you get these RTAs or these questions back and ping pong back and forth, some of the tips that Jon and I are talking about today will do exactly, will help you do that. Moving on to the next common mistake, and that is not providing all expected testing. Not providing all expected testing. And one of the things that you mentioned in your column, Jon, is FDA used to accept, quote, I promise statements, or in the regulatory world, what we call a promissory note. Can you explain to the audience, Jon, what you mean by an I promise statement or a promissory note?
Yeah, keep in mind, I'm old. I've been doing this for a bit. I mean, the gray hair and the beard should give some of that away, but back in when I started my career, 510Ks have been around since almost before I've been alive. So they've been around for a while.
1976.
1976. So I was born in 75. But anyway, back when I first entered this industry as a product development engineer, I mean, obviously, as we've talked about, the 510Ks, the workhorse, that was the most common approach that the company I worked for at that time, that we pursued for FDA regulatory submissions. At that time, I'm talking late 90s, early 2000s, and this is probably a true statement up until 2010-ish or so, give or take. Sometimes there's tests that lengthier and whatnot. And a couple of examples that come to mind are things like sterilization validation, sometimes shelf life testing, in some cases, some biocompatibility tests, et cetera, et cetera. But back in those days, back in the good old days, we used to be able to say, yes, we acknowledge we need to do this. It's underway. It's in process, et cetera, et cetera. We promise to do this, and we promise that it will be done prior to going to market. And that used to be an accepted practice back then. But my understanding, that's not been an accepted practice for quite some time. And I think the reason is, it's probably quite obvious. I think a lot of companies made these I promise or the promissory note commitments, and then they didn't do it. And so now FDA is like, that's not an acceptable practice anymore. If you're submitting a 510K, thou shalt do the testing. We no longer accept I promise promissory note commitments, because people before you, companies before you, they didn't always follow through and do it. So don't think you can go to FDA with a 510K with some sort of promissory note to commit to do it before you go to market. It will be expected at the time of the submission.
Yeah, good point, Jon. So just to recap, so a promissory note in the regulatory vernacular is something that we say to the FDA, here's 95 or 99% of our submission. These few little bits, whether it's shelf life or sterility data or something like that, we will provide to you a little bit further down the road. In the meantime, will you please, chew on what we've given you? That was, up until several years ago, I don't want to say common practice, but it was an accepted practice. Today, it's not so much. And the reason, as you just pointed out, is because regrettably, and I do not take pride about saying about this with our industry, regrettably, there have been companies and people in them who have promised to do certain things who have never gone on and do that. Yeah. And so as a result, FDA has gotten burned a few times. Yeah. And so I wouldn't go so far now, Jon, as to say that FDA won't take a promissory note, because they do still take them. I've had them taking them for some of the submissions that I've been involved with very, very recently, but it has become very much the exception rather than the rule. Okay. A promissory note should be kind of like going to the ombudsman. It's a path of last resort, and I have companies all the time. They ask me, well, Mike, can we give FDA 95% of our submission and let them start chewing on it? Kind of like my graduate students, can I give you a draft of my report and you can mark it up and give it back to me so that then I'll, when I teach in universities, they don't pay me enough to do that. Similarly with the FDA. So you cannot give them a draft. Right. You can take it to them with a pre-sub. And if you're planning on doing a promissory note for things like sterility or shelf life or stability testing, definitely bring it up in a pre-sub to make sure that it's okay with them. Because if you're springing it on them at the point of actual submission, as you point out very well in your column, Jon, you might be able to fake it to get it through the RTA, administrative review, but they're certainly going to pick it up on the scientific review. Absolutely. So my advice is use it only as a last resort, but if you're going to do it, plan on bringing it up in a pre-sup in advance to make sure that everybody knows that that's what's coming.
Absolutely.
Okay, moving on to the next of the 7 common mistakes. That is not doing real-time shelf life testing, not doing real-time shelf life studies. So why don't you explain a little bit what you mean by this, John, and why is this such a common mistake?
Sure. And shelf life, I was trying to think, I'm sure there are examples. Well, let me recant a little bit. I believe FDA is looking for you to address the shelf life for any and all medical devices. I think it's more, well, I don't want to put a label on whether it's more or less critical, but a lot of my experience, certainly in my formative years in the industry, I designed and developed single-use disposable devices. And most of the time, not always, these devices were packaged and terminally sterilized via ethylene oxide, sometimes gamma or what have you. But nonetheless, it's manufactured, sterilized, and it's going to probably sit on a shelf either at a distribution center or at the point of use until such time that it's needed. A lot of the devices that I worked on, we usually targeted a 3-year shelf life from data sterilization. We can't just make that claim arbitrarily. We have to be able to corroborate that shelf life is applicable and appropriate for that product. Obviously, if I'm making, I'll just use something I'm very familiar with, a catheter that has been packaged in a Tyvek peel pouch that has been sterilized by ethylene oxide. I can't just arbitrarily say, yep, it's just like this other thing, slap 3 years on it and we're good to go. I have to be able to support that with objective evidence. I have to be able to prove that. But it's not pragmatic or practical for me to wait until I have that real-time 3-year shelf life data before I submit my 510K, because obviously, 510K, a catheter type device, I'm not stating specifics here, but generally speaking, from concept to go to market, that could be an 18 to 36 month project to begin with. So if I have to wait 3 years after I finalize my design to do the real-time shelf life studies, that's just not pragmatic. So what a lot of companies do is they support this with oftentimes accelerated aging and whatnot, or maybe they go to market with a reduced shelf life instead of the 3-year. Maybe that's the target. Maybe they come to market with a 1-year or what have you. There are a lot of different approaches to this. But regardless, part of my strategy and my planning, when I'm in product development, I need to basically put that into my overall plan for this product, that I need to reserve quantities of product that have been packaged and sterilized, et cetera, and I need to keep them on a shelf over a period of time. And I need to, at certain intervals along the way, I need to pull some of those samples and I need to conduct representative testing to be able to support and demonstrate and corroborate that my product is stable and effective and safe and all these sorts of things along that intended shelf life. I've rambled a little bit, but hopefully that's a little bit clear on what I meant by that.
I think that was very good, John. If I could just add on a little bit further, exactly right. Real-time shelf life testing is one option, but most companies don't want to wait around for that data real time. So there are oftentimes methods that we can use to accelerate that process by putting your device in a heated environment or with increased humidity or something like that. You need to, though, make sure if you're working on a conventional device, there are probably standard methods to do these kinds of things.
Yes.
And you need to make sure that you're following these standard methods. However, it really comes down to the device itself, the design, and specifically the material. So if you're using a biostable material, if you're talking about, say, a bare metal coronary stent, packaging issues aside, what's the shelf life of that stent? 1,000,000 years? Nothing's going to happen to that stent. But for example, if you're working on a bioabsorbable material, now all bets are off. It's not a biostable material, it's a bioabsorbable material. And further, if you're working with a combination product, putting a drug or a biologic or something like that on a device like a stent, doing accelerated testing becomes very, very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Even traditional shelf life testing becomes very challenging to do. This takes this conversation multiple levels higher, John, but never mind a drug, putting a biologic like a monoclonal antibody or a gene inside of a virus on the surface of a stent, the whole notion of putting that on a shelf and having it sit there for some number of weeks or months is just nuts when you think about it. So for most of our audience that are working on conventional, as a biomedical engineer, John, dare I say it, boring medical devices, shelf life and sterility and stability is pretty straightforward. But
Right.
for those in our audience that are working on newer, more challenging kind of technologies, such as the ones that I just described, now it becomes much more interesting discussion. Most important thing to remember, John, I know you're obviously a big fan of the design controls. One of the most basic tenets of the design controls is that you want to do your final verification and validation testing, your V&V testing, including shelf life and sterility and so on your final device.
Yes.
And that includes your packaged device after it's been on the shelf for whatever period of time. I want to reiterate the strategy that I also give to a lot of my customers. If ultimately you want to have, say, a 3-year shelf life claim, but you don't want to wait, you don't want to hold up your 510K submission to support that claim, especially if you have to do it in real time, you can start out with, say, a 6-month or a 1-year
Exactly.
claim, get it onto the market that way, and then go back later as a label expansion and increase your shelf life claim that way. So that's a common strategy. And the last tidbit that I thought I would bring up here to kind of challenge our audience a little bit, it's one thing to talk about shelf life for traditional medical devices. It's another thing to talk about shelf life for, say, combination products or bioabsorbable materials. But how about the shelf life for an SAMD? Software is a medical device.
It's tricky, right?
Most people would say, well, gee, how the heck is shelf life an issue when it comes to software? Well, this is another example, John, of when I see people trying to understand the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. The spirit of the concept of shelf life, the philosophy of shelf life, is what happens to your product in the future. Mm-hmm. In the case of software, if your software is running on, say, a computer with Microsoft Windows platform, what happens as future updates issued, to that software? So although the concept of shelf life doesn't maybe map directly to a device like software, philosophically, the concepts are very, very similar, if not the same. Would you agree with that, John, or am I just smoking my socks?
No, I do agree. And I think the summary of this topic is, regardless of whether or not you're working on a, quote, boring medical device or like an SAMD or even an electromechanical device, you need to address the topic of shelf life. Don't just assume, oh, well, I'm SAMD, FDA knows it's software, no big deal. Obviously, there's no shelf life because it's not sitting on a shelf. Don't assume that. Explain it. Provide the rationale and the evidence as to why you've taken the stance that you do.
But it is, you mentioned it's not sitting on the shelf, but let me extend that metaphor a little bit further, John. It is sitting on the hard drive of your computer or your phone or whatever it is.
Right.
And even though your device might not be changing, the environment around that device might be changing. And so, again, I would argue that the concept of shelf life, at least philosophically, is directly applicable to software as it is to anything else.
Yep.
Okay, so let's move on to the last couple of common mistakes that you identify in your column, John. The next one is underestimating risk management requirements. Underestimating risk management requirements. One of the pieces of advice that you give to the readers of your column, John, is be prepared to show your list of requirements and provide the paper trail for your traceability and your DHF, your design history file, and the other quality requirements. I'm curious, John, if you can just explain for our audience, why is that important in the context of a 510K?
Yeah. Again, I'm dating myself a little bit, but I can recall, definitely can recall long before ISO 14971 that the current industry standard for medical device product risk management was established. I also have an opinion that design control best practices in and of themselves are a risk management approach because, you're defining user needs and the requirements, and you're doing the verification and validation of your product to, demonstrate that it works the way it's supposed to for the people that it's supposed to work for. So that in and of itself is risk management practice. But, in today's world, there is an expectation, I think, by FDA and probably many other or most other modern regulatory bodies that 14971 and risk management practices are deployed for your device. But a big component of this, like I said, it does go back to the design control piece. I mean, you're identifying what can go wrong with your particular product, and not to sound dire here, but you need to, sometimes when things go wrong, people could get hurt. So how are you preventing, or how are you controlling your device so that those bad things don't happen? Or if those bad things do happen, how are you giving the doctor, the nurse, or the user of that product a warning, an alarm, or some sort of notice that, hey, something's not right here? But regardless, you need to be able to think about all of these different scenarios. And you think about the normal read the DFU, the directions for use. But let's be real. I mean, you and I have talked about this a lot. That's probably the first thing that gets tossed in the garbage whenever someone gets a product. So think about other ways to this. You and I have talked a lot about human factors and things in the past, and not to rehash that whole topic. But risk management is really thinking about all the ways that your product are going to be used, whether used the way you intended and expect, or the way they might actually be used. So I think it is an expected best practice these days to be able to document those types of scenarios and those cases, and make sure that you have the right controls with your product so that bad things don't happen.
Well, Jon is a very experienced and very capable quality professional. I understand and I agree with the importance of documentation. The only thing that I would add to what you just said, Jon, is in the context of the 510K submission, a lot of that quality documentation doesn't directly go into the submission.
It's true.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's not important. It's very important. And you have to have all of your quality ducks in a row. But a lot of that stuff comes in the form of a manufacturing inspection when FDA comes knocking on your door.
That's true.
It's not part of the actual 510K submission. It is sometimes part of a de novo submission. And it is very often part of a PMA submission. But because we're trying to focus on 510Ks here, I just wanted to point that out. And specifically when it comes to risk, and you and I have talked about risk many times, Jon, and as our audience probably knows, I happen to be a subject matter expert for FDA in risk. The risk requirements for the 510K are the most important. It's not the risk management plan. That's important as well. But meeting the risk requirements for the 510K are what's most important. And just to reiterate them very, very quickly, in order for it to have a successful 510K when it comes to risk, there's two boxes you have to tick. The first is you have to show that there are no risks in your device that are not already present in the predicate. That's risk requirement number one. And risk requirement number two is of the known risks, you have to show that the level of those risks in your device are the same or lower than they are in the predicate. Right. In other words, hypothetically speaking, if FDA can identify one new risk that's in your device that's not in the predicate, or if they can identify one risk in your device that's higher than it is the predicate, then that would be enough, at least theoretically, to trump everything else. And for FDA to say, sorry, your device is not substantially equivalent, you need to be considering a de novo or maybe even a PMA here. And I can also tell you, Jon, that in the past, those risk requirements have never been interpreted as literally as I just explained them, but they are being interpreted that way today.
Yep.
For the benefit of our audience, Jon and I have done a lot of other discussions specifically on risk and provide some references to go into that in much more detail. But Jon, let's move on to the last two common mistakes for 510Ks. The next one of my personal favorites, and that is not demonstrating equivalence to a predicate. I'm pretty sure that I understand what you mean by that, Jon, but for the audience, why don't you explain what you mean by that?
Again, to remind folks, hopefully this is information that listeners already know. But the whole premise of a 510K is that you are demonstrating substantial equivalence to a predicate device. In layperson terminology, basically that means I'm comparing my product to something else that FDA has already cleared, and I'm making the case that my device is just as safe with same or known risk as this other product. Hopefully that's not too much of an oversimplification, but I need to be able to corroborate and demonstrate that. And a lot of folks are like, what do I do? Just call up my competitor and the predicate that I'm planning to use and order some products and do side-by-side comparative testing and analysis? Well, sometimes you could do that, sure. But a lot of times, this is some of the nice things I think about, freedom of information and a lot of this being available in the public domain. Hopefully if you're citing a specific predicate device that you're going to compare substantial equivalence to, hopefully you've reviewed as much information about that product as you possibly can, including that device's 510K submission. And a lot of times when you do this, there is quite a bit of information that you can glean and extract from those submissions. I mean, go to that product's website, read the literature, find as much information as you possibly can. There's lots of ways to be able to demonstrate equivalence, I think. To me, certainly saying, the predicate device, and this is very, very generic, and I don't mean this to be taken too literal, but the predicate device is blue. Oh, my device is blue. The predicate device is a pound. Oh, look, my device is pound. So, you're trying to basically tell the story that, this predicate device has these characteristics. My device has, I'll say, similar characteristics or substantially equivalent characteristics. And you have an approach to this I really, really like, so I don't want to steal your thunder on this. So hopefully that helps folks understand a little bit that the bar you're trying to get to is that my device is, for all intents and purposes, the same as this other thing that I'm comparing it to.
Well, first of all, Jon, I'm flattered that you said you don't want to steal from me. I would encourage you to do so, because there's an expression, if you're going to steal from the best. So I'm kind of flattered, and I'm going to steal from you in just a moment. I think you can probably guess how.
Yeah.
But I thought it was interesting. You started out this part of our discussion by saying that most of our audience is probably familiar with this.
Oh.
Well, I question that. I'm not sure that the data really would support that claim. And the reason why I say that, Jon, I'll share with you a statistic that I've shared many times. It changes a little bit, but not much over many, many years. About 75% of 510Ks that are submitted to the FDA today in 2022 are rejected. And of those ones that are rejected, about 85% of them are rejected specifically because of substantial equivalence or the lack thereof. So I find it fascinating how so many people in this industry, they think that substantial equivalence is such a simple concept, such a no-brainer. Well, if it is, how can you explain the statistics? And part of it is, Jon, the devil's in the details. You mentioned anecdotally that, well, if the competitor's device is blue and your device is blue, but what if it's not exactly the same shade of blue? What if yours is a darker blue and theirs is a lighter blue, and so on and so on? The regulation says that your devices have to be substantially equivalent. That does not say that they have to be exactly the same. And any differences, whether we're talking about differences in the technology, like, for example, the blue color, or differences in the labeling, the company needs to address those differences and specifically say or show that these differences, their device is light blue, mine is dark. That's not important because A, it does not create new questions of safety and effectiveness. That's requirement number one. And B, as I just talked about a minute ago, it does not change the overall risk. Every single difference, whether it's a change in the labeling, you're using one word and they're using another word, or there's a change in the color or whatever technological parameter, every single difference, you have to go through that analysis of, does it create new questions of safety and efficacy? Does it change the overall risk? And then the last thing that I'll mention, because we've done a lot of things on substantial equivalence. I've done a webinar for Greenlight on substantial equivalence. We can provide a reference to that, as well as the different 510Ks. Every form of 510K relies on substantial equivalence, the traditional, the special, the abbreviated, and now even the safety and performance or FSP 510K, but substantial equivalence in a different way. So just briefly to recap that, traditional 510Ks, about 75% of 510Ks are traditional. You need to show that it's substantially equivalent to another device, a device that's already on the market. A special 510K, about 20% of 510Ks are special 510Ks. You need to show that your changed device is substantially equivalent to the pre-changed device. In an abbreviated 510K, or what is now sort of morphed into the safety and performance 510K, you do not show substantial equivalence to another device. You instead show substantial equivalence to a standard, to a guidance document, to something like that. So in every single type of 510K, you need to show substantial equivalence. But how you show it, to what you show it to, is different. At the end of the day, the regulation, which, as you pointed out earlier, Jon, the 510K was created in 1976. The regulation has not changed one sentence, one word, one punctuation mark since 1976. Yeah, there have been guidance documents that have come out, but the regulation itself has not changed on substantial equivalence. The regulation says that you have to show your device is substantially equivalent. It does not say how you show it. That's up to the manufacturer.
Right.
Moving on to the very last one, and then we can wrap this up, Jon, is formatting of the submission incorrectly. I would like to think that this is a no-brainer. What you're talking about here is submissions that are rejected under administrative review. Just to remind our audience, when you submit a 510K or any submission to the FDA, it's a two-step review process. The first step is the administrative review. The second step is the scientific or the substantive review. The administrative review is nothing more than when a bean counter sits down at FDA and looks at your submission, and they have their version of the RTA checklist, and they say, do you have this section? Do you have that section? And make sure that you're not missing anything. Make sure that you have all your signatures and so on. Make sure that you don't leave the page numbers out, which is one of the things that you mentioned in your column, Jon. I would like to think that, people have graduated from elementary school. They don't need a reminder to put your name and your page number on your homework assignment. But regrettably, Jon, 38% of 510Ks that are rejected by the FDA, 38% are rejected on administrative review.
Yeah.
And I've said before, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, when a 510K or any other submission is rejected by the FDA on scientific review, maybe FDA has a difference in your scientific methodology or your statistical analysis or something. Okay, that's fair job. That's FDA doing their job.
Yeah.
But when FDA rejects your submission on administrative review, it's not FDA or anybody's fault. It's 100% the company's fault. So given that you wrote this column 5 years ago, Jon, but the statistics still remain about the same, about 38% are rejected on administrative review. Why is that? And what other advice can you give to our audience to eliminate that?
Why is that? I don't understand, because to me, this is just, it's common sense. I mean, I was trying to think, well, it's basic technical writing or what have you, but it's common sense. I mean, I am preparing a bunch of information to support my claim, my indications for use, my intended use of my product, that it's substantially equivalent to a predicate or a multiple predicate or whatever the case may be. We can talk about that at a different time. But I'm making the claim that it's substantially equivalent to something else that FDA has cleared on 510K before. It's my story, right? The point you made earlier, maybe my device has been published in some scientific journal. I mean, just to think, FDA is going to go Google that or PubMed, find that. And that's naive. Come on. Tell your story, but make it easy for the reader to follow your story. And, simple things like pagination. And that is so easy to do. Every modern word processor does that these days. It's just things like that. Providing a table of contents, just making it very, very simple. I mean, this is the textbook, so to speak, for your device, or the executive summary textbook for your device for FDA to review the information. I mean,
you started out, Jon, by saying that this is common sense, and I agree this should be common sense.
Well, if 38% of things are rejected, it says it's not common sense.
Yeah, but unfortunately, common sense is not as common as we would like to think. So I would go back to one of the first pieces of advice that you gave in your column, Jon, and that is follow the RTA checklist.
Yeah.
It lists many of the things that we just identified, including things like table of contents and page numbers. So follow that. And for those that are working in the 510K universe, you could at least be comforted in the fact that you're not working in the PMA universe. Because in the PMA universe, believe it or not, Jon, the level of micromanagement in the submission is phenomenal, to the point where FDA specifies font sizes and margin spacing and so on and so on. I mean, that to me is insulting, if not condescending, but we don't have that in the 510K universe. The other thing that you said, Jon, that I like very much is tell a story. Obviously, this should be written as nonfiction, but it should be like a novel. It should be something that somebody can sit down and read, and make it easy for the reader to read. Don't make them jump through a bunch of hoops. I get drafts from my customers all the time that are painful to read. I literally mean painful. One last thing, and then we'll wrap this up, Jon. As you know, I work as a consultant for the FDA. So I see submissions coming in to the agency from time to time. And some of these submissions are terrific, but other submissions, they are literally painful to read. It's like, did you go to elementary school? Do you know how to construct a sentence with a noun and a verb and so on? Make sure that this thing is readable. It sounds like common sense, and it is common sense. But unfortunately, it's not as common as we would think. So what are your final thoughts, Jon? Any final pieces of advice to send our audience to ultimately try to improve the statistics that, in spite of your very good column that you wrote 5 years ago, a lot of people seem to be running into these same problems over and over again?
Folks, if you're curious, the simple piece of advice is get somebody else's eyeballs looking at this. My experience a lot of times, a 510K submission is a collaborative effort. Sometimes, you divide and conquer. Maybe I take this section, you take that section, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, somebody's got to put it all together, right? And when somebody's put it all together and you've got the final draft or a draft that's ready, go find your professor, maybe call Mike Drues or Jon Speer and say, hey, before I send this to FDA, can you look over this? I mean, that's the simplest, easiest thing that can be done. I think one part of that might be helpful is, it could be somebody within your company, that's cool, but maybe they don't have the intimate knowledge. It probably shouldn't be somebody that's on the project team that's reviewing this, right? Because they're going to be, sort of preconditioned, so to speak. So say, oh, well, I know this because I worked on the project. Find somebody that probably hasn't worked on the project. They might be a little bit familiar, but they don't have intimate details. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is find an objective reviewer that's not FDA before you submit it to FDA. That's the simplest, easiest thing one can do to try to correct some of these mistakes.
I agree with you, John. And just to wrap up my part of the conversation, and then we can wrap up today's discussion, I would just like to amplify and throw a little gasoline on that last suggestion that you just made, and that is get some other eyeballs on this. One of the things that I find so fascinating and quite frankly so scary about so many medical device companies is who's the first person to see your submission outside of your company. It's usually the FDA.
I know.
And to me, that makes absolutely no sense.
None.
Get somebody, whether it's John or myself or somebody, to come in, and I don't need to be self-serving. I'm trying to share some of my.
I mean, we're tired of talking about these mistakes, right?
We are. But one of the things that I do with my customers is before they go to the FDA with their pre-sub or their submission or whatever it is, they'll ask me to come in, put my FDA reviewer hat on, read through their documents, sit through their presentation, and if I can be a bit blunt, bash the hell out of it. Because the idea is, going to make a mistake, better for them to make it in front of me. What do I count? I don't matter, as opposed to making it at the FDA. And I don't want to go so far as to say that if a medical device company can get their submission through me, they can get it through the FDA. But I've been doing this long enough, John. I make a pretty good surrogate for the FDA.
I'm sure.
If you have somebody come in and review your submission and say, oh, you're doing a wonderful job, pat yourself on the back, have a parade, they're not doing their job. You want somebody to come in and be brutally honest.
Yeah.
And the last thing I would just remind you and our audience, John, is I know you're an expert when it comes to the design controls. This is not a foreign concept. What I'm describing here is the concept of an independent reviewer, right? But it's not an independent reviewer in sort of the engineering sense of the word, which is the connotation of that regulation. It's the concept of independent reviewer in the regulatory sense of the word. And so once again, John, we don't need more regulation to solve these problems. We've already got thousands and thousands of pages of that. What we need is more people understanding the intent of the regulation and being able to apply it in different circumstances. Whether you're talking about applying the concept of independent reviewer to regulatory review, as I just discussed, whether you're talking about applying the concept of shelf life to software as a medical device, as I discussed earlier, you've got to get past this literal interpretation of regulation and think much more broadly, maybe even a little more philosophically, if you will. Those are my thoughts, John. Anything that you would add, and then we can wrap this up.
No, I don't know. I think that's a good place to stop the conversation. And folks, please, a lot of these things, as hopefully you've picked up from Mike and my conversation on this topic, they're absolutely in your control. These are things that you can absolutely take care of yourself. And with a little help, again, sometimes when I work on something, I know what's there because I wrote it. I could take it to my mom and she's going to think that it's amazing and she's going to want a copy of it and she's going to want to put it on her refrigerator.
Put it on the refrigerator.
My mom, might not be the best person to ask to give a critical review. As Mike said, find an independent person, somebody that can be a little bit more critical, because I want someone who's friendly to the cause, so to speak. Not the FDA isn't, but I want them to beat it up, rip it apart, mash the hell out of it before I send it off. So then, if you can't find anybody, reach out to me, reach out to Mike. We'll happily help you. It's just, we wanted to change the statistics on this topic. These are in our control as an industry.
Could not agree more, John.
All right. Well, Mike, thank you. It was good to go back and sadly review an article that I wrote 5 years ago that is still applicable and appropriate. So industry, listen, pay attention, change this, make this article obsolete so that we don't have to talk about these mistakes anymore. And I hope you're enjoying the Global Medical Device Podcast. And until next time, we'll talk to you real soon.